So good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for coming to this, our second webinar in the series of Overcoming Barriers Facing Survivors of Child Sexual Abuse, run by 1 in 4. This will take about half an hour, and there will be time at the end for questions and answers. So you can use the Q&A function on your screen to ask any questions as the conversation unfolds. Today, we're talking about trauma, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Felicity Kennedy, who's a psychotherapist and clinical supervisor with a special interest in psychological trauma. And Felicity is also a board member of 1 in 4. So Felicity, you're very welcome, and thank you for taking the time.
Thank you very much, Maeve. It's a great pleasure and an honour. So thank you.
Okay. So maybe just to start, you do a lot of work with clients who've experienced trauma. What would you see as the greatest barrier to working with trauma?
I think I've given this some thought, and I think I'm going to take a rather unusual approach by saying perhaps the greatest barrier is ourselves as practitioners, in that trauma, and particularly childhood sexual abuse, is extremely disturbing to us. It is human cruelty, it's human suffering, and it has a devastating effect on children. So for us to stay steady and sturdy in the work can be extraordinarily difficult. So there are a few aspects to how we work with trauma that are really important. And I'm thinking initially of us as practitioners having a steady theoretical framework that guides us in the work. And by that, I suppose it's important to say that trauma is relatively recent as a concept from a psychological perspective. And it was really only categorized in the 70s, 80s as a result of the wars, actually. The increasing realization of the effect of the First World War and then the Vietnam War. So sometimes trauma is categorized as almost the public sphere of the impact of trauma, and the public sphere being the wars. But at the same time, some 70s, 80s, 90s, we started to look much more seriously at relational trauma. And that's the more private sphere of trauma, what happens behind closed doors and within trusted relationships. So the concept of complex trauma became into our awareness as practitioners in this area, that the trauma takes place in relationship and the harm takes place in relationship, and the harm in childhood sexual abuse is the violation of trust and the violation of the care that is supposed to be provided within a trusting relationship that is violated over and over and over again. So it has particularly devastating impacts on the child and on all or any of us who've experienced it. And those impacts can be disturbing and hard to work with in the therapeutic environment.
Can you just say a little bit more about that, Felicity? Because you started by saying the biggest barrier is ourselves as practitioners.
Yes.
And that the difficult work, in your experience, can you, I'd be very interested how you experience that in the therapy room.
I think it's particularly hard to stay steady in the therapy room, and I think having a clear theoretical framework helps us stay steady. And what can shake us and rock us in the therapy room is the extent of the distress that is brought into the room. And that can be, I suppose, child abuse itself has an impact on our identity, on how we manage emotions. It can create shame, it can create helplessness, a depth of sadness, a depth of confusion. And all of that comes into the room, into the space. And for us as practitioners, it can be very hard to sit in that space. And there's a concept, yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, yeah.
There's a concept of communication by impact, which is the client is really, really trying to tell us as a practitioner what's going on for them. And it's sometimes referred to as projective identification. We can identify with the depth of emotion that a client is conveying to us. And in that, we can, well, just to roll back a bit, the reason that people do this is that in an unconscious dynamic, it is to convey to us as therapists what I, as a client, am experiencing. But it means that we as therapists can pick this up in the room unconsciously. And they're very deep emotions. They're emotions of fear, they're emotions of certainly a lack of trust, emotions of anxiety. The point of a client doing this is that we can really kind of get an understanding of what the world, that person's world, is like. But what can shake us in the room is that we will pick up those emotions, we'll feel them in our bodies. And if the theme is a lack of trust, or the theme is anxiety, or the theme is emotion, or the theme is grief, we in turn can be very prompted to experience those themes, and those themes influence how we respond. So what I'm really saying is that we may pick up that theme of a lack of trust and stop trusting ourselves as therapists. We may pick up the theme of confusion and be confused about how we respond. We can pick up a level of grief, or a level of sadness, or a level of anger, certainly hopelessness and helplessness. And all of this can prompt us to stop trusting ourselves as therapists, as practitioners. And we can, in that, move towards doing instead of being. And
now that is really interesting, because, you know, you've sort of described the very relational healing that has to take place. So when we become involved in doing with our clients rather than being, what does that look like?
It means we jump to action. We start using too many verbs. We're carers, and we want to make things better. But we can, as practitioners, instead of trusting the relationship, we can look outside ourselves, and we can start looking for techniques. And sometimes some techniques are helpful, but essentially what is really, really helpful is the relationship, and the relationship we have with the client. The point being that if harm happens within the relationship, it is the relationship that is healing. So the relationship that we provide as a practitioner needs to be almost the counterpoint to the relationship that has been defiled, spoiled, within the experience of abuse. So the relationship, therefore, needs to be trusting and gentle and take time and take that lovely concept of attunement. I was just thinking earlier today that attunement is like, and maybe this is where the concept comes from, two violinists playing off the same hymn sheet, the same music score. And in this case, the relationship, the client is the leader, the client is the lead violinist. So we are following with a level of gentleness and a level of care and a level of humility what the client is telling us and saying.
So how would the client know if we're attuned to them?
It's up to us to convey it. We keep our expertise, our ego out of the room. We go gently and carefully. We acknowledge that the relationship is the power with relationship rather than the power over relationship. We know that trust will take time, and we give the relationship time. There is no reason why somebody who has experienced relationships as untrustworthy and confusing and hurtful are going to come in and talk to us as a practitioner. So we give time, we're always taught to keep rigid boundaries as therapists. In this case, perhaps we're a bit more flexible in our boundaries. And we come in with a level of humility into the work and acknowledge that the client is the expert in their own experience of what has happened.
Mm. You know, you mentioned the helplessness that we can pick up from the client, but make our own, and that we can feel de-skilled, a bit hopeless maybe. How do you manage that, Felicity?
The best way of managing it is to be self-aware. It's to use our own awareness of what's going on with us and acknowledge that that's there, but that is coming from the client, and not allow it to prompt us into the doing, not let it prompt us into acting too much. So it really is a lot around for us, and being very, very aware of what's coming up for us. And sometimes we can share what's coming up for us with the client and just name it in the room. And sometimes not. Sometimes it's more helpful to stay steady in the work. But I would see the level of awareness that we have as practitioners around how we are moved by the work and how we are disturbed by the work as being really important in this work.
So almost as clues to the client's inner world, the client's inner experience.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Felicity, you know, at 1 in 4, as soon as somebody walks through the door, they're acknowledging that they've experienced some form of child sexual abuse and that there may well be trauma involved. But I mean, working in private practice, how do you recognise that in the room that you're dealing with trauma?
You recognise it by what the person brings. You can recognise it. Again, I would go back to us as a practitioner. I would recognise it if I felt helpless or confused or de-skilled. I would recognise it if I felt myself somewhat even distant from the client, or somewhat zoning out slightly from the interaction, because those of us who've experienced any form of abuse can use all sorts of strategies to remove ourselves from what's actually happening in the room. So if I, as a therapist, found myself removing myself from the client, it can be an indication that something was behind, something was going on here. I would notice the anxiety, probably. I'd notice a level of fear in the relationship, a level of not trusting me. And I would try to sit very calmly and steadily in that, and not be panicked, not be confused, not run away from it, and not overact or overreact. Again, going back to the relationship, the healing is in the relationship when the harm has happened in the relationship. And it's to stay very, very steady in that.
You've mentioned the word steady quite a few times, Felicity. And I mean, is that something that is innate to us, or is it a way of being that we can learn through our training and our experience? I suppose I'm sort of talking about resilience and steadiness in this type of work.
Perhaps a bit of both, Maeve. I think we do have to learn it. I think our instinct as carers is to react, respond, do, help, move outside of ourselves and offer solutions. But the world is full of people who offer advice and solutions. And for us to remain steady in this comes from experience, I think. Yeah. And an understanding of ourselves. And I think for therapists, there's a kind of headline in my head that we see over and over and over again, which is, don't do this work on your own, don't work in isolation. The value of having peers, the value of having colleagues, the value of having supervision, the value of having a reflective, thoughtful space can't be overemphasized.
Okay. I suppose coming back almost to the beginning, in your experience, what are the things that most, I suppose, impede effective psychotherapy? Or the real barriers, I suppose, to effective psychotherapy?
I keep going back to perhaps not having a strong theoretical framework and a strong conviction about how to work and how to be helpful. It's very important to me to have that theoretical framework, which is interpersonal abuse, it is relational abuse, and it is trauma that is complex. It's also very important to me to almost provide the opposite, at a very straightforward level, the opposite of what that person has experienced. So it is to try to provide constancy, security, a secure base, calmness, steadiness, humility, quietness, hope when there's been hopelessness, belief, and a belief that this does work, that relationships heal. And it's not always the therapeutic relationships. It's relationships with friends, it's relationships with communities, it's relationship within the therapy, but it is the relationship that heals us.
There's so many things I'd like to ask you, but one of the things you mentioned is that this takes time.
Yes.
And out there in the real world, because of funding and so on, there's quite a lot of pressure on finding ways to work quickly with people who've experienced very complex trauma. What are your thoughts on that?
I can't see that it can be done easily and quickly. I think it really does take time. We're all different, and for some it may be quicker than others. But I have personally just stopped working with somebody who took her about 10 years. Also, when we provide a relationship, that relationship can be for life. You know, this is, again, we're taught to finish with clients, but sometimes within the depth of the relationship, people come and go, and a certain part is processed, and then life is dealt with, and then someone may come back. So it is to be open within the relationship to the continuing possibility of being there for somebody in a relationship.
In terms of the relationship, I mean, sometimes people who've experienced very complex trauma in relationship in childhood have found a way of being in the world that is an attempt to protect themselves. So pushing people away, with a lot of maybe anger, obviously lack of trust, and some of the other things you mentioned. So it can be hard sometimes as a practitioner to stay in relationship with somebody who quite unconsciously perhaps is trying to push you away, or maybe recreate some earlier dynamics or whatever. Have you any thoughts on that?
Again, it's to stay steady, to know that this is what's going on, and to provide, again, I keep going back to the opposite, in the face of anger, to remain calm, in the face of unsteadiness, to remain steady, in the face of sadness, to acknowledge. And it is everything that is really the opposite of what somebody has experienced: constancy, security, safety, everything that is safe in relationship, and not be rocked by the emotions of the other, or the conflict.
Do you ever find yourself becoming upset in a session with a client where they're dealing with very distressing material, they're perhaps very upset, where it's genuinely just terribly, terribly tragic and sad?
Yes. And sometimes it's to share that upset and sit with somebody in the moment of what they're feeling. Yes, it is tragic and it is sad. And to fully, fully, fully acknowledge that and the tragedy of somebody's life. I remember somebody saying to me, I'm coming to you because I do not want you to do anything. I want you to witness and be with me in the experience of my life.
Yeah. I mean, in a lot of the literature, Felicity, especially going back to things like the genocide in the Second World War and so on, there is a lot of literature on survivor guilt or on bystander guilt, which in a sense we are bystanders to terrible things that happen in our society. Does that notion resonate with you at all? Or?
Yes, it does. And does it come into the room? I don't know, Maeve. I'm not sure if I can answer that. I don't know. I was just thinking of the war, and there's some interesting work. Ironically, in the First World War, it seems that the themes of helplessness and the themes of prolonged strain were really what brought about what at the time was called, by more enlightened people, combat neurosis, if you went shot for being a coward. But it was the prolonged strain of being in the trenches, or being snipers, or being air balloons, that was so traumatic for people.
Yeah.
And the similarity with child sexual abuse is the prolonged helplessness and the inability to be able to take charge.
So Felicity, we've just run out of time. So is there one final thing you would like to say as a psychotherapist?
Yes, that we can, there is hope. You know, we do recover. Well, perhaps recovery is a strong word. We do integrate. We do. This becomes part of who we are. We're not ambushed. Psychotherapy works, and relationships work.
Well, there's a very positive note to end. So Felicity, thank you so much. And I know that there are some questions from the people who've been attending the webinar. So I'll invite Kerry, who's one of our staff, who's going to put the questions to us. So welcome, Kerry.
Thank you, Maeve, and thank you, Felicity. We've actually had quite a few questions related to what you were saying about being witness to the experience, not necessarily having to do anything, but just to bear witness, which is so powerful. So there's been a lot of questions about practical advice for practitioners who work with people who've experienced trauma and what comes up in a session. So 2 questions here. One is around supporting clients who experience an intense, physically triggering flashback in the middle of a session. And secondly, the emotional impact of sitting with a client when they experience tiredness or fatigue, flatness in the session. How do you work with that and translate it with your clients?
I would Maeve, would you answer the first one, and I'll have a think about the second one.
Okay, well, in relation to flashbacks, I mean, that is a situation where a client is experiencing some aspect of the trauma as if it is happening in the here and now. It's not as a memory or a nightmare or something. It is as if it's happening in the here and now. So the way I would work with that is simply to be very present, very steady, to use Felicity's word, not to get frightened. It's a very normal part of a trauma response, and just to work with the person to help bring them back into the present moment, help them ground themselves, to breathe, to be aware of me in the room with them, and help them gradually to come out of that experience and be back in the room with me, in feeling safe and so on. And I mean, flashbacks, I would say too, that the content of the flashbacks can often be very useful material to work on, not at that moment, but as the therapy progresses, because it can be, it could be that our client is, for example, remembering some aspect of the traumatic experience that they hadn't been aware of before. But the thing is, as Felicity says, stay steady, don't be frightened, and just help the person come back into the room. So, Felicity, I don't know, does that fit with what you...
And in response also, completely, Maeve, and in response to staying steady with somebody who was feeling tired or unavailable in the room, I would just be very, very gently present. And I would use my voice to say, I'm here, I'm with you, or whatever feels very simple, very steady, and very, very soothing in the moment. I would not stay silent, because silence can be used as a punishment for children. So I would be careful not to be silent. I would take great care to be very attentive to somebody.
Thanks, Felicity. Are there any other questions, Kerry?
Yes, another person wanted to, either of you, to kind of say something more and speak about shame, particularly in relation to existing within the experience of getting therapy for child sexual abuse. So really speak to the significance of shame, how that is a barrier, in which we spoke a bit last week in our webinar, but really just in relation to trauma, like how significant is shame around the psychological response to trauma?
Maeve, will you start with that?
Well, okay, I wasn't expecting to have to, so,
Okay.
but I will. No, I'm very happy to. I mean, with child sexual abuse, we would see shame as an absolute core experience of child sexual abuse. The abuser projects all their guilt and distortions and so on onto the child. And shame is very different from guilt. We're guilty about something we have done. Shame is about who we are, our very being. Now, we've all been ashamed in our lives, and the reaction to shame is to hide, to draw back, not to be seen, and so on. So it always requires as very gentle, consistent, slow work in psychotherapy. And it's often the last great impact that begins to dissolve as the therapy progresses, as the client trusts the therapist, and as the client feels embraced perhaps by, in the gaze of the therapist, when they feel that they have been seen fully and liked and cared for. And, you know, I mean, I could give loads of examples of clients who just feel disgusting, horrible, ashamed. And I'm actually looking at these most admirable men and women who have overcome enormous adversity and are really doing their best in the world, very likable people. So that's in a very short space of time, maybe, how I would answer that. And I don't know, Felicity, if you'd like to add anything.
I think there's something also here about the projection that Maeve was saying of the abuser's shame into the child, because the child is not usually imprisoned in some way. It's a psychological imprisonment. It's coercion. It is narcissistic coercion, so that the perpetrator will fulfill the needs of the perpetrator. Sorry, something coming up on my screen here. So shame is very much part of the experience of that, because the shame comes from being forced to do or be in some way that is violating.
Okay, I think we've run out of time, actually. It's just after 1:30 now, so we're going to have to finish. So again, I would like to thank everybody for attending today. To remind you that our next webinar is in 2 weeks' time at 1 o'clock on Thursday, and it will be about barriers to accessing the criminal justice system. And I'll be speaking with our Advocacy Director, Deirdre Kenny. So to thank Felicity so much for taking the time today. I mean, I just thought that was fascinating, Felicity, and I think we've all have learned quite a bit. So thank you very much, everybody, and hopefully we'll see you at the next webinar.
Just to remind everyone, if any of your colleagues were not able to attend this session and all of the lunchtime webinar series will be uploaded to our website after the live stream. So
thanks, Kerry, I forgot to say that.
Thank you. Thank you, ladies. That was very, very insightful.